USAID on its governance and stabilization across the MENA, Middle East and North Africa region. He has over 25 years experience. You look good for 25 years experience, Paul. Well done. In 90 conflict-affected countries. He's been deployed to 45 of those as a diplomat, an activist, an academic, a researcher, and a peace builder. Paul's taught courses on extremism, conflict management at American University and the University of Maryland, and other centers of excellence. Yasmina is currently working with Creative Associates. She is our chief of party for the USAID Inclusive Governance and Resilience activity in Burkina Faso. Yasmina has 17 years of experience leading country teams, mobilizing partnerships, resources, designing, implementing programs, conducting research, and providing policy advice. Her expertise includes and spans the MENA region, Central Africa, among others. Kate Cheatham is, well, I'll have Kate, you introduce yourself if you like.
Hi all, my name's Kate Cheatham. I'm a senior program associate here at Creative Associates, supporting our Syria portfolio and also a Honduras violence prevention program. And I work with Dean on Creative's learning agenda as well.
Thanks, Kate. Myself, Dean Piedmont, I'm a senior technical advisor with Creative Associates. I spent 10 years and a lifetime before that with the UN, other NGOs, deployed overseas for several years. Currently working on armed group reintegration, PCVE, DDR, and related issues. So moving right into this, what we know is drivers of instability in West Africa are increasingly regional. We see the US government doing two things in tandem, minimally, working on more regional programs while also driving locally led development. So this leads us into what are these programs looking like and how do we move to scale them? And again, that's what we're going to talk about today. By the end of the session, we're hoping that our participants will be familiar with USAID's responses at country and regional levels to gain an awareness of impediments and solutions when implementing regional strategies, including missed opportunities and things that have worked. And we want to identify some scaling types and factors that enable programming, successful interventions. Now, the scaling itself comes out of Creative Associates Learning Committee and Learning Agenda, where we look very specifically at scaling, and Kate's been part of that effort with us. We've looked at a lot of the other literature on this. MSI has a lot to say about this. And what we did is try to produce a very relevant and simplified model for scaling that can be juxtaposed over these programs. So what do we mean by scaling? We want to focus on three types of scaling. I won't go too far into it. We want to talk about horizontal, vertical, and diversification scaling. And horizontal scaling, quite simply, would be taking a program or initiative and scaling it across a larger geographic area. This could be contiguous or non-contiguous. A vertical scaling would be a bottom-down and a top-up approach, moving from a pilot to a program to policy, something that becomes institutionalized and kind of anchors itself vertically and expands. Diversification or functional scaling would be scaling across a thematic area where a PVE would turn into reintegration. Reintegration would then inform education. Education may inform strategic comm. You have a widening of your initiative across different areas. What we're going to do here is hand over to our panelist, and Annalise will be discussing missed opportunities and lessons from the Accra initiative across the Sahel G5 and the Lake Chad Basin. Paul will discuss with us early warning and early response mechanisms that began at Chevron, scaled through ECOWAS into the Niger Delta with Creative and the Karuna Center, And then Yasmina will talk to us about vertical and horizontal scaling in Burkina as a conflict to escalating, as a response, my apologies, to escalating conflict. From there, we'll give panelists an opportunity to speak with each other and respond to each other, and then we'll move to a Q&A, ask targeted questions along the way. And Elise, we'll start with you and open the floor to you, please. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Dean. And thank you to everyone who has come to listen to us, and especially to my fellow panelists. I'm excited to discuss this further with everyone. So as the first panelist, and as the one who's mostly worked in policy and lesson programs, I really wanted to take a look at how scaling has manifested from the regional institutional outlook. So we're really taking a macro perspective on this. Looking at all three versions of scaling, I suppose, could be applicable in this sense. But the big thing that I wanted to discuss was some of the missed opportunities and lessons learned that are both applied and usually not applied when we continue to fund, finance, and support these regional institutions, particularly in West Africa. So starting with the Lake Chad Basin, moving to the G5 Sahel, and then also thinking a little bit about how all these issues will be applied to the coastal West Africa regional initiatives, also known as the littoral regional initiatives, when there is the galvanization towards institutionalizing a lot of the programs that will be funded over the next few years there. So one of the ways I wanted to frame this conversation was really to look at how, in terms of missed opportunities with things like stabilization and preventing and countering violent extremism, one of the biggest issues that I have personally seen, particularly from the policy side of things, is that there's a lack of honesty in taking stock of what has worked and what hasn't worked, and what is, relatively speaking, behavior change programming in conflict affected areas, and then redistributing those projects, scaling them up to other regions without really taking stock also of who's in the room, who the other partners are, and how we can coordinate better. I found that the lack of honesty, the very fact that it's obvious that when we're doing a monitoring evaluation of a program, we always, we as the partner want to make the case that our project is always successful, coupled with the fact that donors don't really want to see a failed program because they're constantly trying to reappropriate money as quickly as possible, so as, quote, not to lose it when it comes to obligating money in the following fiscal year. There tends to be this kind of lack of, I use the term ground truth. I think that's an inherently military truth term there. So I apologize to my fellow development and humanitarian partners in the room. But there's lack of taking stock of what's actually going on the ground with the impacts that these projects have, not just within the actual microcosm of the space where the beneficiaries live, but also within the external space of where those beneficiaries might have an impact, and how that can be horizontally scaled up, the impact at least of it. As a result, I don't think that we also take enough time to really take stock of what has been successful and what hasn't, which means that when we replicate these programs, we scale them up to other locations, or just vertically within the same, or I guess horizontally within the same location. There's often a failure to kind of figure out what went wrong before redoing the project over again. So I kind of broke this down into a few big issues that I think need to be, relitigated when looking at how to scale projects. The first is the importance of defining objectives at the onset of a project. I'm looking at the regional institutions, so it is a little bit more of a lofty conversation here. But if you look at the Lake Chad Basin and you look at the Lake Chad Basin's regional stabilization, the strategy, the RSS, the Regional Strategy for Stabilization, Recovery, and Resilience of the Boko Haram affected areas, which was a UNDP program, I recognize, but it did in the end up kind of enveloping all the other projects under it. And then you compare it to how the G5 Sahel was implemented, and then we look towards what's going to happen in coastal West Africa. One of the things that seems to be clear across the board to me was that the objectives that were defined at the onset of these crises didn't have enough importance, let alone relevance, by the time a lot of the money came years later. And then certainly by, many years in the future, when the conflict itself had manifestly changed in so many ways. And one of the biggest challenges to a lot of these projects is that because the objectives are so set in stone at the onset, we like to say that there's flexibility in a lot of the programming, but often that flexibility is not as flexible as we think it is. And it's certainly not as flexible to be able to deal with how other partners, which brings me to my next piece, which is coordination, will look at the same conflict. And we're talking both within the actual sector of development itself, but also across the 3Ds in terms of diplomacy, defense, and development. Defense actors often aren't operating on the same bandwidth that development actors are operating in. And if we're talking about stabilization, it obviously has to be in a coordinated, in sync approach. And this seems to have been one of the biggest Achilles heels of the G5 and the Lake Chad Basin approaches. And one that could, in theory, have been fixed ahead of time, but there were way too many competing priorities from the onset. And then the third piece is ensuring that there is a real and clear end state to programming. A lot of these projects, because of how unrealistic the objectives tend to be, don't have an end state that's likely to be met during the actual duration of the program, and that often gets forgotten, or the net gets pushed further away. And as a result, you tend to lose interest. There is donor fatigue, there is partner fatigue, and then what we see is a protracted response to a protracted conflict that loses steam. And to put into more practical terms, the Lake Chad Basin Commission just issued a request for more funding, specifically with regards to the fact that there seems to have been like a loss of interest in the Lake Chad Basin as the coastal West Africa states start to speed up with the conflict. So, quickly turning to the defined objectives. There's no universal, when it came to these regional approaches to West Africa's crises, the first issue that came about was that there was no universal acceptance of what it meant to respond to the crisis. The term stabilization became synonymous with ending conflicts only a few years ago, and yet there's still no agreed upon definition of what stabilization means in both academic discourse, but also in programmatic discourse. As such, the Lake Chad Basin's stabilization definition tends to violate some of the tenets of humanitarian principles just by actually politicizing humanitarian aid, which is principle either 3 or 4 of the actual project. I realize I have to speed up my speech right now, so I apologize, everyone. But the point of what I'm trying to bring up here is that a lot of the competing agendas and the limited coordination that exists for scaling up projects is, in my opinion, where you see a lot of the failures. This is where functional, horizontal, and vertical scaling is so important, because we need to take stock of the lessons learned, but we also need to ensure that there's better coordination, not just between partners, but also between the sectors on the ground. And in my opinion, there needs to be more coordination between the civil and the military efforts to deal with these complex crises, but that's a longer conversation that might come up during the questions. I think I'm at time. Am I? Yes, okay.
Thank you very much, Annalise. What I'm going to do is we're going to move over to Paul and then Yasmina, and then I'm going to backtrack with a question for each before we go into the wider Q&A. There's a lot of great stuff you're bringing up here, Annalise. When we talk about scaling, we're talking about horizontal. Again, the movement across a geographic space, vertical from local programming into policy, and then, of course, functional, touching different content areas. What we've also identified, and Annalise is pointing to these, are various factors that we believe, and evidence is showing us, are necessary when moving to scale, certainly preferred. Necessary may be strong. And these are multi-stakeholder engagement, systems approaches, and the need to be user-centered. So when we circle back, Annalise, I'll ask you a bit about the systems approach that you're unpacking. And Paul, I'll do the same for you and Yasmina, and package it in a different way, pending your presentations. Paul, over to you, sir.
Thanks, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where in the world you might be. As Dean mentioned, I work at the Fund for Peace, and in earlier parts of my career, I was with Creative Associates, and both organizations work together in part of what I'll be discussing. More than 10 years ago, Fund for Peace set up a partnership with Chevron, who is very active in the Niger Delta in being able to get oil from there and move that around the world. They set up something called the Niger Delta Partnerships Initiative, which was a bit of an oversight board, if you will, that was an independent entity where Chevron staff would be detailed over to that to oversee and support a local organization that they funded called PIND. The Fund for Peace got involved with PIND and started to help them kind of build out their capabilities and expand their capacity too. One of the original things that was desired was to stand up an early warning system. And so we spent years working with PIN to really build out kind of a best-in-class local system that covered the Delta, that had the ability to have a network of individuals reporting in to share what some of the dynamics were that were taking place across the Delta, which was still at the time a very unstable place. And then also being able to leverage tech tools. So looking at different data sets, doing web scraping, et cetera, and complementing the information that was coming from individuals and civil society organizations from across the Delta. And over time, that really evolved and became quite a solid system. There's an example here, I think, of the diversification that can take place in scaling as we went from a focus on early warning to then saying, well, how can we start to build out response capabilities? And so set up a partnership with another local organization called Partners for Peace, and through PIND trained more than 10,000 mediators that were there at the community level to be able to engage early and often to prevent de-escalation. So there's much more that can be said about that, but that's really where we built out deep relationships in Nigeria. We, Fund for Peace, started to work with Creative on a project that was funded by Reward, along with another organization called the Karuna Center for Peacebuilding. And under Reward, there was a similar idea of being able to support an entity. In this instance, it was ECOWAS. They already had a fairly well-developed early warning and response system, but we were tasked with trying to refine that. And so this is a clear example of vertical scaling. We went from a very kind of subnational localized effort to something that covered 15 countries and started to work up and down that spectrum. So we worked within ECOWAS and the Early Warning Directorate. We were also working at the national level as we built out capacities within the different member states as they stood up national early warning and response centers. And 11 of the 15 countries now have those in place. And then we also were working to train civil society in different capabilities. So again, the vertical scaling, the horizontal scaling across the 15 countries, and the diversification took place as we worked through a human security lens in that early warning and response system and moved to address challenges that ranged from violent extremism to electoral violence prevention and a number of other topics as we built out capabilities and capacities within civil society and within governments to be able to both understand and respond to the challenges that took place there within the region. So I think it's a really interesting example of serendipity or what have you, being able to kind of drop into place and allow some of the real wrestling and good thinking that we did looking at global early warning systems and seeing how those could be contextualized in the West African context at the local level, and then really being able to inform a regional entity, which often struggle to be able to understand what takes place at the ground and be able to advise them in a supporting capacity as they wrestled with all the challenges that they were facing, trying to figure out how they could take an idea and really have that achieve a little bit greater impact. I assume that most of you that are here in attendance today are fairly well versed on the dynamics within West Africa, but clearly there's a lot of work to be done on the early warning and response front. But I do think that there have been some really interesting impacts that range from averted coups to being able to build out tighter relationships between civil society and national governments to really deepen that system of early warning and response. And within those relationships that have been cultivated and nurtured, I think that we'll see kind of processes emerge from that, and the ability to engage with a more holistic effort, as opposed to a single organization working within a community, or even a single national government working on a challenging problem, because so many of the problem sets there aren't isolated by borders, and they're flowing across the region. And so the ability to both take a regional approach, a national approach that works with other countries, and a local approach, I think is a really interesting evolution that's taken place within that early warning space. And ECOWAS is really a global leader in terms of their ability to really shape the early warning agenda and the systems that have taken place there. Although we didn't work on it, there's also one last example of scaling that has taken place in this arena, which is the tightening of the relationship between ECOWAS and the AU, which has a continental early warning system. And so they've continued to strengthen the bonds between them through everything from conferences, information sharing, sharing best practices as well, whether that's how data is manipulated and analyzed, or sharing ways that they are looking at promoting and catalyzing response within their different kind of areas of responsibility. But I'll stop there. Happy to dig into some more details, whether it's over chat or in the conversations that come. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. This is interesting. It's very compelling. I think what we're starting to see, and Paul, really good presentation on the different scaling types and the examples here. So within the same region, we're seeing very different things play out. We're seeing an example of where scaling was, let's say, suboptimal, subpar. And I think a lot of Annalise's experience pointing directly to this. And in a case where Paul's experience is, we see much more achievements being. Can we?
In fact, can you join Wally?
I'm going to ask if can our participants kindly mute themselves? Okay, I don't know if we have that ability to do that here. So what we see
I'm
also.
trying. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Julianne. So what we see also is examples of successful programming, successful scaling. A theme that's coming out, and we'll circle back to it, is I'm very curious about the issue of intentionality. And we're starting to lean in that direction. So we'll see if that needs to be unpacked later on. Yasmina, over to you, please.
Thank you. So actually, well, as you said, we discussed, scaling not going so great, and then scaling actually being successful. And right now, what I'm going to be talking about is scaling in the making, and what we're going through with AGR is this, because I'm going to be talking about how scaling is often thought of and approached by donors and implementing partners and national counterparts as an exit strategy, as something that happens at the end of the process, as the cherry on the icing. Sorry, can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay.
Here, Yasmina, please continue.
Okay. So
I'm going to ask if I'm sorry, if AFP, if you can mute people who are not speaking, would be appreciated. Back over to you, Yasmina.
Thank you. So in the case of IGR, it can also be an adaptive management strategy in complex crisis contexts, such as that of Burkina Faso, because responding to immediate crisis for inclusive governance for resilience, it's IGR, it's the governance, local governance activity in Burkina Faso, USAID. So Creative advocated for and was able to scale both horizontally and functionally as a response to a rapidly escalating and expanding conflict context after only 1 year of implementation. So how did that happen? So it was a local governance for resilience programming in the epicenter of the conflict in the Sahel. So obviously IGR was focusing on both building partnership between local governments and their citizens to improve responsive civil service delivery, social cohesion and resilience, and providing support to local actors to develop communal level roadmaps to resilience to support the advancement assessment of decentralized governance and to strengthen the capacity of local governance to mobilize resources, among others. And it's also, with a strong P and CVE component as well. But all of this was designed at a time of relative peace and stability in Burkina Faso. And as you all know, I think in this call, in this session, the context rapidly deteriorated shortly before the project was awarded, which was, a little over almost 2 years ago. So Burkina Faso is currently ranked, as I think you all know, second country on the Global Terrorism Index. So of course, this is a context that was forcing IGR to implement in the epicenter of the jihadist conflict in West Africa. And the questions that were brought to us by partners and by the donor, by colleagues at times, by local counterparts, civil society, was, the relevance of the project. So it was almost a context, and I know it might sound dramatic, of scale or die, and not just grow or adapt, but literally, scale, take both at the geographic level and at the functional level. So by the time IGR startup phase was over, Burkina Faso was going through its first coup d'etat of 2023. We already had two. Let's hope, it stops here. Reshuffling the institutional framework, IGR spent extensive resources to analyze and integrate in programming. So the conflict's rapid expansion and escalation was challenging the project's geographic scope and its programmatic limitations. And so reacting and adapting to multiple and multidimensional contextual shifts can only take you so far. And this is why we started, as a group. When I say as a group, the state.
We lost all internet for a bit there.
Yeah.
I thought it was a problem at my level, started wondering, where is everyone gone?
Yeah. So we have 9 participants. Let's give another 30 seconds. What we'll do to make up, guys, Yasmina, you can, we'll have you pick up, and I lost you a little bit after. It was brilliant. Scale or die. After your presentation, what we'll do is we'll go to the plenary Q&A, and we'll skip the questions that I was going to ask so we get more participation from the audience. In the end, if we have time, we will circle back.
Okay.
So, Yasmin, we have 19 participants. I would say just pick up from wherever you feel that you got cut off, and we'll see where we land time-wise, and we'll manage it from our side. Over to you.
Thank you. I think everybody disappeared after I said scale or die. So I'm not going to respond again, to this. And I'll just say that scaling was not referenced as a goal or outcome of the project initially, nor because there was no predefined explicit pathway to scale in the original design. It was dictated by the needs of the target groups, the pressure of expanding violence. And I keep saying it, both internally and externally, from, the donor, from the team, from the partners. So that's why, when we moved ahead, with advocating for scaling, despite the fact that it was just, a year after, the implementation kicked in, we started looking at the factors. Were the factors favorable to scaling? And we realized they were present despite the early stage of the project, because the co-creating the roadmaps to resilience involved engaging multiple stakeholders. I'm talking governments, civil society organizations, end users in the design phase and throughout the implementation, with the end users at the center of the intersectional assessments from the very beginning. So the project system approach also relies on complementary analysis of stakeholder networks, thinking, working politically, APA, applied political economy analysis, and understanding the drivers of fragility and resilience at the local level. So we were already there. And the local partners and the donor both challenged the project's initial scope repetitiously, because it was perceived as partially responsive to the complex crisis. So we were really pushed again and again, to grow, to be able to, not just an adaptive measure, but beyond that. And so that's why the scaling was both horizontal, and I'm talking geographic expansion. And to be honest, it also enabled us as a project to always have, zones to be able to fall back on, when things got really complicated in our initial zones, and functional in the sense that, we moved beyond the initial scope by focusing on the practicalities rather than the politics of governance. Now, after two political let's just say two coups d'etats and political upheavals, it was necessary in mainstreaming stabilization in local government capacity building, civil society strengthening and social cohesion building beyond the initial scope, integrating a youth strategy. So these solutions, I keep saying it, were dictated by the contextual shifts and demands of the end users and the donor and the government counterparts. But in a case of mid-project scaling and not a scaling as an exit strategy, we also realized that we needed to adapt our knowledge management, tools and strategies as well, to look at it from a different perspective. That we realized that we needed, for instance, continuous feedback loops and learning moments, because the learning curve was incomplete, and because of the pressure of the contextual shifts, we needed to learn faster. So I'm going to stop here, and of course, I'll be happy to answer questions during the Q&A sessions. Thank you.
Yasmina, this is great. Excellent recovery with that internet blackout. Well done. Really well done. So other things are coming to the fore now. And I think what I'm hearing here is, Yasmina, it's the strengthening or that theme of intentionality coming back to us. Paul had referenced that the experience was serendipitous, unique in that regard, where Annalise is speaking to us about the lack of definitions, objectives, and goals. And Yasmina noting that this was not, the goal of scaling was not written into the original project. What's very interesting is that in all areas, our notion or our model of scaling is standing up. There are horizontal, vertical, and functional elements that could be looked at that would either increase the efficacy or have seemed to be put in place. The factors seem to be there. And Yasmina, you brought up the fourth, and we had left that out because it's a very unique one. And it comes with intentionality, and it comes out of the creative research as well. It's the knowledge. And what we were able to learn, that knowledge knowledge needs to be broken into three phases to be effective. And this is left out of a lot of the literature. It's left out of a lot of practices. It's the gathering of the data. It's the synthesis and analysis of that data, turning it into knowledge, and then the intentional targeting of your audience. Where is this going? Very important if we're talking about locally led development. Very important if we're talking about gaining further donor support. Very important if we're talking about national government or regional responses at the policy level. I have a series of questions here that I'm going to defer. We have, I can't do the math, about 22 minutes left. I am going to save 5 minutes toward the end, but I would like to open it up now for a general Q&A and have our participants give them the opportunity to provide input and or ask questions. So feel free to use either the raising hands or the chat function, and I'll hand over to Kate to start to monitor that. Over to our audience.
Anyone would like to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand or to put a question in the chat.
And my mistake, we have more time than I thought. It was great. We have actually 35 minutes, so we can really have a robust discussion. I'll give a minute or two for people to raise questions or not. And if not, then I'll forward us with, I'll advance with our questions. Paul.
Hi, I just wanted to follow up on something that surfaced just a little bit in what we were sharing, and just as a quick reflection while people are processing a bit, and that is we went into this program with ECOWAS with a 5-year USAID funded project, which is a fairly long-term commitment. It ended up running to almost 8 years by the time that the project ended. And part of where it emerged from is this decision within the U.S. foreign assistance community to try and build out capabilities within the regional centers across Africa. And so I hope I presented what I see is a fairly successful project that took place. However, at the end of those 7 to 8 years, there was a lot of momentum that had been built up and a lot of progress that had been achieved. That to-do list kept growing. And I've been really disappointed in the fact that the result of a fairly successful project has been to kind of just walk away. And there are some upcoming USAID procurements that have components that may continue part of these initiatives that were taking place under ECOWAS in the early warning and response space. But there's been a 2-year gap, and that has a really major implication on the impact of momentum and the ability for our partners, whether they're local, national, regional, or international, to be able to sustain themselves. In this unique circumstance, I think that some other donors have stepped forward, but that as we look at both what Annalise was sharing and the real need to look at opportunities, not just in the short term, but what are we really trying to accomplish and where are we trying to take things in the design of the project as well as its implementation, and how Yasmina shared, the ability to seize on changing circumstances. I think it's just really crucial.
Paul, thank you very much. I see we have Hind, we have a question on your side or a comment?
Yeah, thank you, my colleagues of long ago, creative associates. Thanks, Dean. Good to see Annalise and Paul. Good to see you too. Yasmina, I don't know you, but heard really good things. Sorry for jumping in a little late. My question is more with experience, the rich experience that you guys have on this. Is coordination is really key when scaling things like this up. And I think one of the things that is really of interest is when working with the regional institutions and trying to establish a regional based effort to navigate the complexities of the region and dealing with many of the issues, including security and stabilization. A coordination between ECOWAS and Sahel, and also with local government actors, and sort of streamlining policy is really key here. And I think that's a challenge for any region, let alone a region that we're dealing with here. I'm just curious to know sort of like your take in terms of how effective that was in terms of establishing that or not establishing that, because developing policy really requires the internal, institutional country by country coordination to share resources, as well as to leverage, even if it's small gains, just leverage where things can be expanded on. So expansion isn't just, and I apologize if you spoke about this, as I missed, I jumped in just when Paul was talking, but expansion of scaling of programs is not just the footprint of programming, but it's also the scaling up of efforts uniformly or sort of cascading efforts from country to country as it's leverage. So I'll stop there. I'd love to hear you talk about, if that was achievable, if it wasn't achievable, what would be done differently? Thank you.
I can start and then definitely pass it to my fellow panelists. I think this also kind of brings together one of the questions that was just thrown into the chat by Emma about what is a realistic and successful way for implementers to tackle doing this type of coordination, including working with donors and program design. I'm going to speak to my previous experience when I was with the State Department at Niger, and I was working on the Lake Chad Basin response primarily. there was no formal process to coordinate between anyone, whether it was within the government of Niger itself on interministerial issues and the collective response by the government towards the Boko Haram crisis. Among donors, you had your biweekly OCHA humanitarian coordination syncs, which are super important and super helpful to get the right people in the room. But it had nothing to do with actually coordinating the broader response that includes other actors outside of just emergent humanitarian issues. And then, of course, there was absolutely no donor coordination when I got to country. And this is the worst answer that you will ever get. And it's definitely going to be the one that infuriates everyone in this call because it's just frustrating. But I found that it was ad hoc and it was explicitly driven by personalities. And that if I myself hadn't sat down and forced some of the people that I knew, both on a personal and professional basis from Niamey, into a room to sit down and discuss, okay, you're working in DFAT has nothing to do with DDR, let alone the Lake Chad Basin crisis explicitly, but it is focused on at-risk youth who may or may not be also in other parts of Niger. Let's see how we can bring this all together. If I hadn't done that hand-holdingly, then I don't think there would have ever been any version of a collective response within Niger itself. You have a lot of regional instruments that claim to do this coordination, but the problem is, and we all know this from having gone to all these exhausting conferences over and over again, is that it ends up just being a lot of the same people talking about the same exact projects over and over again. And there tends to be this lack of cohesion. And one of the points that I wanted to bring up in my part before that I totally went over time and didn't get a chance to is that I think that until you get the donors to really come together on a collective agreement on what the response is going to look like across the board, from security aid to humanitarian aid to the longer term development and post-reconstruction aid piece, then you're never going to be able to get a cohesive and comprehensive coordinated response. And you're just going to have to deal over and over again with overlapping projects, overlapping priorities, and the absorption problem as well. So that's my short answer. I'm going to punt it to my other fellow panelists for them to chime in.
Well, can you comment? Hind made a very interesting point about making policy advances, and then I'm going to take the liberty of circling back to Annalise's comments before we go to our see if we have any other questions here. Paul, anything on your side?
Yeah, I just wanted to share something. It's getting a little bit at where Annalise kind of stopped, and also the question that Emma raised in the chat. And I think one thing that we've found to be marginally successful, because we've been able at Fund for Peace to kind of bridge this gap during this lull that I mentioned in donor attention to essentially providing some volunteer support. And I know that that's not ideal, and my board would probably be upset with me if we talked at length about how much we've done to support ECOWAS during this time frame. But that's allowed us to bridge the funding that came from USAID to we anticipate starting projects with both GIZ and funded by the African Development Bank that will be bolstering the capabilities and to some extent the capacity of the early warning directorate there to continue their work in early warning and response. And the other thing that I wanted to mention that's kind of following up on Annalise's point, kind of more from the donor perspective than the implementer's perspective, is there was a really significant commitment by the Department of State when I was there to work in the support of the independence of South Sudan. And I recognize this isn't in West Africa, but I think it's talking to the challenges of scaling. And so we were able to push several people out in country to expand the capacity of the consulate at the time that was there in Southern Sudan and Juba, and really scale up the amount of programming that was taking place. I think one of the most successful parts of that initiative was the fact that donors were meeting on a weekly basis that really understood what was taking place across the country at the country level, and trying to figure out where the challenges are and who and how they could be addressed. And that resulted in kind of the synthesis of efforts that I've not seen when I was working in 10 different countries with the US government ever, and have rarely heard of similar efforts outside of that. But it allowed kind of a unity of purpose to really surface across all the different actors on the international level. And I think that was respected by our counterparts within the South Sudanese government. And then to reflect again on some of the challenges of scaling, new leadership came in within the US and decided that perhaps that wasn't as necessary, both in terms of the level of our commitment and the integration within the international community. And then within 8 to 12 months of that, South Sudan began what has become more than a decade of really significant struggles after a small kind of glimpse of hope and freedom and independence. So just wanted to offer that kind of quick reflection.
Paul, thank you for that. Very helpful. I see we have a comment or question from Albie. I'd like to hand over the floor to you, sir.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah.
So, hi, it's for Yasmina. I'm interested in learning a little bit more about the scaling approach happening in Burkina. Particularly, I know you mentioned it's been super challenging because of the ever changing landscape and how fast it's changing. I was a Peace Corps volunteer there in 2014, 2016. So I saw how Burkina went from, I think, relatively peaceful to, like the especially changing landscape now. So I just wanted to see if you can like expand upon that and kind of talk about, I know you mentioned a little bit about the data and how key it is to be able to have really accurate and up-to-date data and working with local stakeholders to be able to move anything forward. And I just wanted to get your a little bit more perspective and expansion on that, if you can. I know time's limited.
Over to you, Yasmina.
Thank you. Dean, can I share my screen for just a second?
Let's give it a shot.
All right. So let's see if I can. And this is to answer you. So I don't know if you can see my screen right now.
We can see your screen on our side.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think that if you see my screen, you can see, on this map, how the context has deteriorated rapidly from 2015 to 2023, and how the violence has expanded, like almost like a bad skin disease, like measles going all the way, and spilling over in Ghana, Togo, Benin, while when you look at this map, I mean, what I want to also for everyone to see is also the timeline of the project. So when the project was being thought of, was being designed, during the program design, the conflict was still, I would say, in the, let me try and stop sharing, and get back here. So, it was still sort of at least from the perspective of the project, still in the margins, whereas right now we're looking at an expansion that's almost touching every single part of the territory of Burkina Faso. So the first part of the decision, you were talking about intentionality, the decision to scale geographically is also, whether we would move the project to other territories, to other geographic area, or to continue operating in our initial geographic areas and then, expand elsewhere. So that was, one of the conversations we were having, but also as the conflict was expanding, the context was also shifting, and it was not just because of the human tragedies that come with it, but also the institutional changes after 2 successful coup d'etats, I guess, what would call successful, but like consecutive, and I would say the rapid changes of priorities of our local partners, especially of our donor as well, of civil society activists we're working with. So, and we were also challenged repetition, I mean, over and over again by our own, partners. And again, I keep saying it by the donors about, how relevant it was to still work on strengthening local government, for instance, in a context similar to that of Burkina Faso right there. So these were, the reasons why we moved ahead on the one hand, with this scaling, both functionally and geographically. And I also mentioned at some point, moving from the politics of local governance to the practicalities of local governance. And what I mean by that is that initially the idea of strengthening local government and local governance went through, I would say accelerating the decentralization process. It was also supposed to strengthen the legitimacy of the system put in place. We were looking at these aspects as when we first started conducting, the assessments. Shortly afterwards, we found ourselves, grappling with the necessity to strengthen citizens' access to basic services. Running almost is as if time was no longer on our side, running to be able to continue strengthening the system, the local governance system at the local level, of course, in a context that was shifting at a dramatic pace. So that's, one of the reasons also why I was saying that, knowledge and assessments were key. And I think this is also something that I've seen in other instances where, when facing complex crises, we would move ahead to stabilization, to surge, to implementation at a faster pace, while not taking the time to think, to assess, to gather data, to analyze, to look at the lessons learned, because, it has a high transition cost. It's resource intensive, right? To find the time to pause, reflect, look at the data, conduct, research, while it's critical in contexts like these to understand what's going on, to understand the power dynamics, to find the power brokers, to be able to work with the right, I would say, with the right stakeholders. And so that was also one of the reasons also when I was looking forward to this session, actually, because for a project like ours, a session like these sessions like these are a luxury. The ability to sit down with peers, and intellectualize and think through what's happening in a context of a complex crisis is a luxury. And so these moments are the ones that also help us think through what happened, think through, how we've chosen to adapt and why we've decided to scale. And I'm not sure I answered your question.
No, you did. Thank you so much. I
You're
appreciate it.
welcome.
Alba, Yasmina, thank you for that. Yasmina, I'm going to ask you to push a bit further into this. And I think what I'm hearing here, you're pointing to, and the visual was interesting because we see a dramatically shifting conflict context. And you brought it up through all of this, governance is an issue. Security clearly an issue. And this is not far off from the opening remarks. Rob Jenkins very clearly points to underlying governance issues being all part of this. We're talking about a bit of the factors when we start to talk about knowledge, and that came up kind of after we talked about the vertical and the horizontal and the functional diversification scaling. Alba talked about the importance and wanted to know more about the data, and you were talking about the analysis. Can you spend a bit of time talking about its dissemination? What did you do with this knowledge, and where does it go next? Part of scaling could be what's occurring here today, sharing knowledge here, and then again, how intentional is that? But I'd be very curious to know about some of the dissemination and the targeting of this knowledge. Over to you.
Sure, of the institute of the intersectional assessment, right, and the different, okay, so of course, sharing with the donor, obviously, and this was at a critical time because, we finished our intersectional assessment right around the coup d'etat, and so it was at a time when, USA, the embassy, and other partners were, still considering, the reaction to what was, happening in Ouagadougou, as well as, the potential impact on programming on the ground, etc., and the other, bigger policy and political decisions. So, of course, sharing, advocating for continuous support to, this critical strategic country, in West Africa and the Sahel. And also, I mean, it was also, a strategic decision for us from the beginning. We promised our partners all the way down to, CBOs in our municipalities, in every single rural municipality, we're operating in, that we were going back with the research findings to them, to discuss with the local partners in, their local languages, the results of that, intersectional analysis of all that research, because it was meaningful not just for us, but more than ever for them in that rapidly changing context. So that was, why, and so that's, of course, sharing the results of the and the findings of the different studies that were conducted with the government, with the national government, with the local government, all the way down, like I said, to the municipal level, also with the implementing partners of USA. RISE 2 has a coordination mechanism. So through the different coordination mechanisms, I mean, we also shared with our partners. And then, we were also struggling with how to best shift the project and pivot based on, of course, the research, the results of the research findings. And it's interesting, for instance, that I recall that right before the coup d'etat, we were already, briefing our AOR, saying that, one of the main challenges in Burkina Faso at the local level is a crisis of legitimacy of the national and local governments. 2 days later, there was a coup d'etat out there, and we're like, it almost feels as a prophecy, because there we were, saying, this is not going so well. So the writing was already on the wall, I guess. So that's actually, why I believe that despite all the efforts, how resource intensive it was, the time it took, that it was critical for us to understand and to keep moving ahead, with the different, assessments and seeking to have, to actually, of course, collect data, but use it, integrate it, and make data informed decisions along the way, can be a game changer in a project like ours, in a context like ours.
Yasmina, thank you very much. We have, and Annalise brings up an interesting point. Annalise, I'm going to ask you a question, then I'd like to go over to Paul, who has an interesting question, maybe a comment here. Let me say, Yasmina, you brought up this wonderful notion of scale or die, and then we're getting this notion, wait a minute, knowledge, learning, analysis. How do we scale up? When do we scale back? I want to spend a bit of time on that. We're going to see a lot of this in our next panel on the Algiers Agreement and armed group reintegration. It couldn't be more central to this. When Creative was doing our research, we realized a couple of things: that getting to scale is not scaling up. Getting to scale is what you promise a donor. That's delivering a program. It's the advances and expanding beyond that vertically, horizontally, and functionally, part of stabilization and development, not delivering your program. The analysis, we also determined, and the dissemination of this knowledge would be able to inform donors, stakeholders, how you could scale and when you should scale back, when you're actually doing harm and risk, or simply wasting resources needlessly. Maybe, Annalise, you can speak to that point a bit, and then Paul, if you have something on that, or Yasmina, and then Paul Turner, if you have something on that, and then we'll go to Paul Ifa for his question. Over to you, Annalise.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think it's a very important, it's probably the hardest question to ask when you're doing programs is, how do we bring in someone to make that hard decision for us? I think this is where third-party monitoring is really effective, but also risk assessments. Two things that I'm actually working on right now is both doing the risk assessments for regional programs, giving them context for when it's time to just either fully pause or take a step back. Actually, one of my partners is on this call right now, and he knows exactly what I'm talking about. But we were just asked by a partner in Mali if they should, what our recommendation was given the increasing insecurity in the Menaka region, and what the recommendation was for continuing humanitarian projects there. And our response was to put a huge pin in the project for now, but potentially consider scaling the project entirely down. There comes a point when we're talking about these complex environments where you have to really take stock of what is working and what is potentially becoming diverted resources that is facilitating armed groups to continue to perform positively on their agendas, and also is negatively impacting the government that you're working with, and also is just a waste of resources, as you mentioned, Dean. And it's not to say also that, and I think this is a little bit more on the abstract issue, but when you have, you know, particularly in-kind assistance projects that are keeping people in one place in a conflict zone, you can risk their own security and safety. And I know that we tend to do a lot of do no harm and safeguarding to try to avoid that type of situation. But a lot of times, and especially what we're seeing in the Sahel right now, and certainly as the Sahel conflict expands really rapidly into the coastal West African states, we're really seeing that projects that have been programmed for 1 to maybe 3 years, such as the Littoral Regional Initiative and the upcoming Global Fragility Act funded projects for the region, they're going to have to take stock of the fact that beneficiaries and samples that have been identified as areas that need to be programmed might not be feasible places anymore. So how do you scale? How do you continue, actually, let alone just scale? I think these are hard questions, and it does require outside conversations, and certainly larger conversations with the donor, which I feel like don't happen as often as they should. And then I will say that I die on the hill of saying not just coordination, but also doing regular research to ensure that the project itself is tying directly into what the real needs are on the ground, instead of what they were maybe 6 months ago or a year ago.
And Elise, thank you for that. It points us smack in the middle of multi-stakeholder engagement and using knowledge to make these determinations. Yasmina, before we get to you, I do want to give Paul Ifa a chance. We're about at 8 minutes to ask his question and have the panelists respond. And given time, we'll move over to you. If not, I want to ask a final question for the panelists. Paul Ifa, over to you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Yasmina, that was a great presentation. My name is Paul Ifa. I'm a student at the University of Unheim in Stuttgart, Germany. I'm studying agricultural economics. Since from December 2022 to March 2023, I was in the north of Ghana, and I also traveled to Burkina Faso. I conducted a field work for my master thesis, and this is an important project supported by the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. And I want to point out the food and agriculture implication of peace from this region that you conducted your study. We did a historical timeline since about 7 decades ago, around 1950 pre-colonial era to date. And we discovered that the instability in that region is really impacting agriculture. At the present times, when we look at the unrest in Burkina Faso, oh, I think I was on mute. Oh yeah.
No,
Sorry.
You're not. We can hear you. We can hear you very well, Paul. It's
thank you. So
gentleman who needs to mute.
Thank you. When we look at the unrest in Burkina Faso, then we see that it is really affecting agricultural extension, because there are some regions that field officers could not reach, and this is really impacting farmers. And also in terms of agricultural programs and support, farmers are really lagging behind. We did a comparative assessment between Ghana and Burkina Faso, and we found that there was a huge difference between Ghana and Burkina, and the major cause was this political unrest. So I would want to say peace is really important, and it is so important for global food and security. So thank you for the project you are working on. This is just a comment, and I want to commend you for the work that you are doing.
Thank you so
Oh,
much.
thank you very much. Guys, we have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to move us to a closing question for each of our panelists. I have about a minute or two to reply. So for each of you, the same question. If you had one bullet point, one singular piece of advice that you could give to the U.S. government on its any initiative, locally led development, the GFA, people-centered justice, PCVE policy initiatives on scaling and programming, what would that be? Yasmina, over to you first. Can you hear us, Yasmina? Paul, I'm going to move over to you with that question. I think Yasmina can't hear us, perhaps.
Sure, Dean. It's a good question, and my mind's kind of all over the place after our exchange today. But I might try and pick up on this idea of that long-term commitment, and what is it that needs to be behind that. And my bullet would be like, look, identify what's in your national security interests, and then commit to partnership. And once you've done that, figure out how you can have the learning agenda that's in place that allows and facilitates the flexibility necessary to change with circumstances, and be there as a supporting partner in the long term. I think we've got evidence of ideas of this within the GFA. And some of the opening sessions, there were discussions around humility, and this localization agenda, I think, is really kind of swirling around this idea of how can, instead of we be going to conduct and implement projects, how can we be then going and supporting civil society and supporting national governments in ways that they may be able to move forward.
Well, thank you. I see Annalise nodding assent. Annalise, 1 to 1.5 minute response, and then to Yasmina.
Yeah, one word: coordination. I will die on the hill of coordination. Some of you have heard me jokingly say that. I think that until we really figure out a way for donors, partners, policymakers, NGOs to coordinate explicitly on everything they're doing, it's impossible to argue in favor of scaling effectively, because everything just continues to overlap. There's not enough deconfliction. And then we waste the very little resources that we have in this space, in these regions, to actually try to create long-lasting impacts.
Coordination. So systems approach, multi-stakeholder engagement. So I'll smack in the middle of what we're learning and how we scale. Yasmina, to repeat the question, I think you may have lost it there. If you can give one bullet point, one piece of advice, guidance to the US government on any given initiative, based on what we've talked about today in our scaling, locally led development, GFA, people-centered justice, PCVE, whatever suits you, what would that advice be? Over to you.
I would say that it should be, part of the, part of the design from, it should be part of the design, part of the vision from the very beginning, that it should be intentional. I really liked, the intentionality part of it, because right now, what we're experiencing with IGR, what I've seen in other projects, how I've been listening to both Paul and Annalise, it requires luck sometimes, benign donors, people with the right attitude, and we can't leave decisions like this on important issues like that just in the hands of sheer goodwill, and luck. That's not how it's supposed to be. Should be systematic, should be intentional, and I think that's the only way we can really I would say trying to find, that's the only way it can be made worthwhile. Because I think, that all the discussions around policy, all the discussions such as ours, are felt differently when you're on the ground. When, decisions like these can impact, the lives of people at so many levels that it can impact, you know, the stability of a whole region. And it should not be left to you know, just a maybe. It should really be put, you know, from the very beginning at the center of the intervention, that we are from the very beginning, from the onset, working towards this goal and not just, you know, hoping for it as an unexpected outcome if all things go well. Because right now, things don't seem to be going well, and yet we are hoping to move forward towards this goal.
Thank you very much, Yasmina. So hope and luck are a good thing, but we shouldn't depend on them. Our knowledge, our analysis, our data, partnership, coordination, and dissemination. With this, we're at time. I want to thank Kate for her work today, putting this together, for the proposal we developed to get us here, and for the work on putting together this scaling framework model. It couldn't have been done, simply couldn't have been done without you there, for sure. Thank you to Annalise, Paul, and Yasmina for attending, for all the work to get us here as well. For our participants, really great stuff. And I would invite anyone who wants to learn more about this, please reach out to any of us. We'll find a way to get you each other's details. Creative, FFP, ELVA community, all doing pretty exemplary work on the areas in West Africa, Central Sahel, and also very, very compelling, interesting work on scaling. And with that, thank you all and have a great weekend.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Everybody, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.